Thanks guys for coming. Very excited to be here with Sky as well, Steve from Sky. And we're going to be taking you through Kids in the Screen Changing the Channel, which is a project looking at the complete picture of content amongst those aged 2 to 9. Before we begin, just to give you a bit of an introduction of who we are, I'm Sadie Buckingham. I'm Associate Director at Giraffe Insights. We're actually kids, youth and family research specialists. It's an audience that we work in and day out. And we are a full service agency in that we do UK and international qualitative and quantitative research. And these are some of the research methods that we have, but actually a really important part of what we do is looking at the wider industry itself and identifying gaps in knowledge, and Kids in the Screen is actually a really good example where we've been able to work with stakeholders to be able to answer some of these questions which do exist in that wider market.
Morning everyone, I'm Steve. Steve Murphy. I'm the head of Insight at Sky within the Sky Media division. So Sky Media is for those that don't know, is the advertising sales arm within Sky. So we obviously sell advertising on our own channels, but we also represent some media partners as well, and those include Viacom and CSC. So we represent, in terms of children's channels, some of the brands we represent include Milkshake, Nick Jr., Nickelodeon, Pop. So some of the biggest names in kids TV channels, commercial kids TV channels. And so in terms of the TV, the UK TV marketplace, we're the largest provider of kids advertising.
So just to give you a bit of background of how this research came about, we know that the way in which kids are viewing content is changing radically year on year, both in terms of the content that they're watching and also the devices that they're using. And actually, TV measurement systems weren't necessarily keeping up with this change, and brands were having to use lots of different data points to be able to complete that picture. So we worked together with some stakeholders to be able to provide that complete picture of both online and linear viewing amongst 2 to 9-year-olds.
And I think for us as well, it was just being a kind of a consortium project. It meant that we were able to do something at more scale than potentially that we could have done if we were working in isolation. So that was really useful. Also, although this is a viewing project, I should mention that Sky are a committed Barb stakeholder and Barb member. And that has always been and will ever be. Barb's still really important to us, not least for Viewing Insight, but for regulatory reasons, and also we trade from Barb, so it's still incredibly important to us. Nevertheless, this study does give us a complete picture of video consumption, which means that we can look at some aspects of viewing that we can't see on Barb. So, for example, looking at specific SVOD services, looking at viewing outside of the TV set. I know Barb is doing a little bit of that, in all fairness. So it was just a really good opportunity for us.
And there are a few differences in the way that this method was created, if you like, which is we actually are capturing a very young age. So we do go down to those 2 to 3-year-olds. And actually in our analysis, this bunch of kids is quite a little bit different. And it's very interesting looking at those differences. And we're looking forward to kind of keeping a track of where these guys are going to go in the future. And it's based on active viewing, so we call this eyes on screen. So because we've been able to focus around these occasions, we've actually got lots of data, like we've been able to sort of deep dive into those individual consumption occasions. We've got lots of questions surrounding each one. We do encourage them to fill it out. We give them an app and a survey, so when they do that consumption occasion, we encourage them to fill it out as quickly as possible so that it's not actually based on claimed behaviour. And we do ask the kids to be involved as much as possible so that actually what we're seeing is from the kid's perspective rather than the mum's perspective. And in terms of how we did it, we actually invited 1,600 kids into the survey last autumn. We then asked this same group of children to take part in another survey in spring, and this has actually enabled us to be able to look at it at a total level, but also start to see some of those seasonal differences come through as well. We asked them to do a week-long diary, so it included weekdays and weekend, which again enables us to look at some of those occasional differences. And it took part over 4 weeks, and one of those weeks included a half-term holiday, so we're able to look at some of those occasions as well in terms of the holiday versus the term time. But as I mentioned, because we're doing active viewing, it's actually been able to allow us to ask lots of questions around each individual occasion. So it could be the programme that they watched, the channel they watched it on, when they watched it, how long they watched it for, who they watched it with, and were they doing anything else at the same time. So it has provided us with lots of information. And because of that, and because we've got the 30 minutes today, we're actually focusing on a few elements of it. Part of it is going to be looking at some of those key behavioural things that came out in our analysis, and because we're here with Sky, also taking a look on that sort of child safety perception as well. So to kick us off, some of it will be around that behavioural, and actually what we do see is that in terms of their consumption occasions, the big screen still very much dictates the viewing. But what we did see in our analysis is that actually the way in which this age group watches and accesses video content is very consistent. There are very definite behaviours that are formed. And we can take two of these behaviours. So we've got the everyday, and that is the term time and the weekday. And it follows the same pattern in terms of it does fit in with that everyday life. So they are watching content when they're getting ready for school, they go out during the day, and when they come back, the content goes back on, and it's one of our peak times in terms of viewing, and then it drops off in terms of getting ready for bed. And then there is the holiday, which is the weekend and the half term. So two very similar occasions in terms of how they watch content. And it's a little bit more relaxed in terms of they're getting up a little bit later, watching content throughout the day, and then we don't get that same peak in the evening, and bedtime is a very similar time. So despite two of these sort of two ritual behaviours coming through, if we actually have a look at the type of content that they're accessing, actually it's quite similar. So both for the everyday and the holiday, live TV and recorded TV makes up the majority or a large proportion of what it is that they're viewing. This is then followed by on-demand and online. And we do see some differences in that holiday period in that they are going on and watching more films, which comes through in the DVD and in the on-demand. But generally speaking, when we've looked at these behaviours, the actual way that they've accessed that content is the same. It is a ritual behaviour. And we can also have a look at the different devices that they're using as well. And whilst we do see some differences in terms of those different platforms, and tablet coming through as another way in which they are accessing that content, if we take a look at all of the occasions that happened across all of the diary, 74% of them actually happened through that big screen. So the big screen still is that primary way to view.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen in 2018 actually, and this is Barb data actually. This isn't from the actual diary. Is that when we look at total TV set usage, we've actually seen an increase this year, which is really positive as far as we're concerned. So kids now using their TV set for around 148 minutes per day. So when we take that into the context, there's lots of insight that exists around TV's effectiveness. So we have, so for example, TV drives more business effects, positive business effects than any other medium, and TV just generally is much stronger in terms of quantifying your return on investment. So when we take those positive attributes from the effectiveness and put it against a scale, then it puts the TV in a really strong place in terms of scale and effectiveness.
And it doesn't come as a surprise because we know that big screen is the way that they want to view, and in terms of where they're viewing it, it is happening in that shared space. In terms of the largest proportion, it's happening in the living room. But actually most of those occasions are always also happening as a shared experience in terms of watching it with someone else. So 70% of all of that viewing is occurring with somebody else. When they're younger, it's more likely to be with their parents, but as they get older, into that sort of the 8 to 9 year olds, it does become much more equally balanced in terms of them watching it with their siblings. But this does have an implication, because if we take live TV as an example, because we collect all of those channels, we can start coding it up in terms of kids content versus adult content. And we can have a look at how that looks throughout the day in terms of kids are watching a large proportion, or it makes up nearly all of what they're watching throughout the day. But as you get to that evening period, we start to see that adult content coming through. But we can also see in terms of who they're watching it with, and in this early evening and late evening period is when we start to see dad coming in terms of one of those top people that they're watching content with. And we can also have a look at the channels that they're watching, and CBeebies is very dominant throughout the day, but when we get to that early evening and the late evening, it's when we start to see those adult channels coming through, like the BBC, Channel 4 and ITV. So it is that sort of adult content. So whilst we do know that they want that content to be shared, it wants to be in the living room on that big screen, it does potentially mean that there is a compromise happening or a trade-off in terms of the content that they can access in that early evening and late evening period. And this is where we start to see online and on-demand platforms coming through to be able to satisfy that kids-specific content that they're after. But what we do see is actually online and on-demand are actually satisfying these very different needs to what potentially live TV satisfies. And if we have a look at on-demand first, in terms of how they watch it, we still see a similarity in terms of that it is still a shared experience. The majority of what they're watching is still shared, and we do see that actually it is still on the TV. But this is where we start to see one of the things coming through where it's different, in that on-demand provides them with a bit of extra versatility in terms of how they watch it. So actually the proportion of watching that content on tablet is increasing. So it's allowing them a bit of versatility in how they want to watch it, but also what they watch as well. So we know that TV programme makes up a large proportion of what they want to watch, but actually on demand gives them that versatility in terms of allowing them to watch films as well. But looking at online gives them something even more different compared to on-demand and live TV. So whilst on-demand and live TV was a shared experience, online is actually something that's very individual to them. It's something that so we've got 58% of them, all of occasions are happening by themselves. So in terms of online and how they're accessing it, actually it's very individual to them. So the majority of it is watched by themselves, but also there's a difference in terms of what devices they're using as well. So unlike on-demand and live TV, actually a large proportion of what they're watching it is on a tablet, so it's watched in a more individual way as well. But also the content that they're accessing. So in terms of TV programme came out top on both on-demand and live TV, but actually for online, the content that they're asking for is video clips. And when we have a look at the video clips that they're accessing, it's actually around interests and hobbies. So it's providing them with this extra, satisfy these different needs, if you like, to both on-demand and live TV. But we can drill down again in terms of what this looks like for the content, because we got the different programs, we were actually able to code these up into the top genres that they were accessing on demand. And actually cartoons came out sort of 50% of what they're accessing on demand. And all of the different genres that came through were very child specific. These are just the top ones. And we can have a look at that throughout the day as well. And when we had a look, actually cartoons was very consistent throughout the day. So in terms of on demand, it's providing them with a very consistent source of child-specific content. And online, it's again, so different genres. So we were able to ask them the specific clip video clip that they wanted to watch online, and actually there were lots of different genres that came out. These are the top 3 that came out on YouTube, and it is very much linked to that interests and hobbies. So again, it's sort of that they are accessing these different platforms to be able to get to that different content and satisfy very different needs.
One interesting thing that we have seen over the last kind of 5 years, and this goes back to what we were saying about viewing with adults, is that we have seen some declines in TV viewing, but interestingly, some of this is what we call less imposed viewing. And a great example of this is the soap operas, because firstly they've been going for 5 years and some. So we know we're looking at the same programme. but with the Barb data, we can obviously look at a kind of like the, like for like 5 years from now versus 5 years ago. And what we can see is that there has been some declines in amongst adults for these types of programs. But amongst kids, these declines have been much, much more severe. And our hypothesis around this really is that, whereas 5 years ago kids just didn't have access to, certainly in terms of video, the amount of devices that they have access to now, is that 5 years ago, and I suppose I can remember when I was a kid, you kind of had to watch TV in the main room for if your parents were watching, because there wasn't a huge amount of choice outside of that. Whereas now, if it's something that really isn't for the kids, they've got the opportunity with their devices to go and consume their content somewhere else. So it's not necessarily the viewing going down; it's just kind of getting displaced from some of the adult content. Into kids being able to consume their content, so to speak.
And actually what we're seeing is, if we have a look at how they are accessing the different platforms, if we just take Peppa Pig and Peter Rabbit as an example, they're actually utilising lots of different platforms to be able to get to that content that they want. We know that they want, for Peppa Pig, for example, the majority of it is done through that TV, but then other platforms make up lots of other ways of being able to try and find it. So for us, it does show very much that the content is king, that they are just going to get to that end destination to get to the content that they want. And this leads us on to the thought in terms of being able to understand those different journeys. So where is that starting point? Then what device do they go on to next to be able to get to the content? And we know that once they've had that content, the action then is to go and try and find some more. So it's about understanding that individual navigation to be able to get to the content and make it as easy as possible.
So one thing that we did want to ask about actually was just about parents and whether they're worried about inappropriate advertising to their kids. And so one question we asked was whether they worry that their children may be showing adverts that are inappropriate for them. And interestingly, actually, we only asked this in the context of online on-demand video players, and they're all kind of in the same pack actually, sort of 26% to 36%, apart from YouTube, where we did see high levels of 68%. Interestingly, YouTube Kids was in the sort of like the pack with the other broadcaster content, but with this research and other research that we've seen actually is that the majority of kids viewing to YouTube is via YouTube and not necessarily via the YouTube Kids site, although obviously there is usage via the YouTube Kids site. And we also wanted to ask specifically about awareness, I suppose, of the independent regulatory bodies. So we asked whether parents believed that TV companies were monitored by independent regulatory bodies, and there was a 61% agreed. And we asked a kind of similar question about online video companies, online video players such as YouTube, and the same figure there fell to with a similar question, fell to 35%. And we also asked about whether that regulation makes their children safe when they're watching TV, and there was 54% agreement for that for the TV. And when we asked whether the parents thought that adverts around the kids' shows on YouTube are held to the same standards as those on TV, there was about a third tended to agree with that statement. And I'm just going to start to wrap up really, but so one thing that we have seen, and is really good to put it into context, because with the Barb data we are able to look over the last 10 years, is that sort of the yellow line graph at the top is the sort of average number of adverts seen per day amongst kids, but that black line is the average number of adverts seen per day by kids channels. And actually, across the last 10 years, that stayed pretty static. And across that 10 years, it's actually amazing to think that some of these things only launched kind of like 10 years ago, like YouTube and Sky On Demand and BBC iPlayer. They kind of like, they feel so established now. But nevertheless, across the last 10 years, we've seen a multitude of launches of platforms and services and things that could, potentially be disruptive to the kids' TV market. But, essentially in terms of their viewing to kids' channels, we haven't seen the declines that might have been envisaged, especially on the top of the the press cuttings that we see, and I always try and save these down when I see them because it always makes good fodder for kids aren't watching TV anymore. They're just stuck their heads in their tablets and they're not doing anything else. And we know that's not true, but it's interesting to see against the backdrop of their viewing that pretty much perennially we kind of get some reasonably kind of big article in what is sometimes some well-established news brands just about the fact that kids just aren't watching TV anymore, and we know that we know that just isn't true. So finally, just this figure's already been quoted, but it's one that we love, is that 74% of their video time is still spent watching on a TV device. So the TV device is still the king, and on the TV device, broadcaster content is still king.
And just in terms of the final thoughts, because this is the first wave that we've done in terms of our understanding how all of these different behaviours are sort of meshing together in terms of live TV and the on-demand and online. But in terms of the next steps, it is about the ritual. So we do know that this really strict ritual exists, and it's about understanding that ritual, but also understanding your target audience's ritual and sort of their individual behaviours, and being able to maximise that connection with your brand, which links on to the navigation as well. So we also know that the way that they're accessing that content, it is again linked to that ritual behaviour, and it's about understanding the different stepping stones that they're using to get to that final content and making navigation as easy as possible. But also identifying, because we know that it is that ritual and they know that they're doing that same thing every day, is there any sort of triggers or influences of triggers that could potentially steer them either away from your brand or towards your brand as well, and just understanding around those navigational behaviours. And tracking. So this is the first year in terms of we know where each of them are sitting, and we have seen some interesting differences over the different occasions in terms of the autumn and the spring. And it's now, and we did see some interesting shifts. So it's now understanding, well, how does that look when we compare October versus October? Are these shifts actually happening, or is it just a seasonal change? So that then effectively those media strategies can be informed and importantly predicted.
That's kind of it. Just wanted to say thanks to Sadie and all the team at Giraffe for some really compelling insight for us. And I think we're going to take questions right at the end.
We've got a couple of minutes, so we could take some questions.
Oh no, sorry, yeah, we're going to.
Finished on time. That's great. So has anyone got any questions for Stephen or Sadie?
Just one going back to the. Going back to the YouTube, because you looked at the other parents worried about the adverts that are being fed to kids, but did you ask the question also, are they concerned about what other content is being fed to the kids? Because obviously there's one stepping stone because there's inappropriate content that's obviously being mashed up with perhaps the classic is like Peppa Pig, of the adult version of Peppa Pig that is online, is also available and it just is auto-fed to the kids to be able to watch it. Did you ask that question, or will you be asking that question?
We didn't ask it specifically, did we? It was. I mean, I wish we had, but we just, the answer is no. But I think that's something that would be really interesting, especially because it seems to get those stories. Because some of with regulation, that's something that sort of parents might not necessarily read about in the papers, but in terms of the inappropriate content, that seems to be the thing that really kind of gets traction. So I imagine amongst parents that that kind of thing might actually get more traction with them than say talking about regulation, which is what we did. But yeah, I think we'll definitely be asking about that, because it'd be really interesting to know.
Have we got any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. We have our next speaker.
Hi, sorry, I was just going to ask, a lot of the research I've seen in the past is about devices and how personal devices like a phone are more kind of sole use, and a TV screen in the room is kind of shared use with family, etc. And it's interesting that you kind of split it differently by online and on-demand as opposed to the device. I wonder if you cross-referenced them and thought about that.
Yeah, so we've done lots of, this is obviously a very shortened version. So actually the on-demand represents lots of different types of demand. So it would be subscription, it would be broadcaster, free broadcaster, paid broadcaster. So actually for the purpose of this presentation, we've kind of netted those together. But we've been able to look at every single platform by every single device. And we've been able to look at that by ages, for example. So this is just kind of a snapshot of what we've got. But we have looked, if you like, at everything versus everything. And I think it is broadcaster, for example, is more likely to be watched on a tablet. And is more likely to be watched by a certain age group. I think the younger groups, for example, do watch things on the mobile phone more than the older group. I think that's one of the interesting things around the 2 to 3 year olds. So we do have that kind of depth, if you like, in terms of what looking at everything versus everything.
Yeah, and it's a really just from a, not that I want to make a kind of sales pitch, but it's obviously people watching it with all the family kind of watching it together. That's just a really important kind of message that we're always trying to land, really.
Can we just take one more question, and then you can always come and speak to our speakers at the end of the session as well.
Oh, hi. I was just interested to know whether you're going to start looking at how parents' habits are changing in terms of, I know a lot of parents are getting worried about screen time and starting to kind of inflict rules, as in, you're only allowed an hour a day, that kind of thing. Have you thought about looking at that, how that sort of behaviour is changing?
No, so some of it we have looked at in terms of age of mum, because we thought maybe the younger mums were driving some of the changes we were seeing in terms of maybe the moves and shifts towards and away from live TV and YouTube, for example. But actually those differences don't emerge. We had lots of hypotheses around it, but there is this consistency, and especially in terms of leaving them alone as well and having that individual behaviour. We thought maybe that would be higher or lower in terms of age groups, but we do look at the mums where we can. But this study is focused generally on the kids and what they're doing and how they're interacting, and we can take the overall picture and look at behaviours, especially when now we're turning it into a tracker in terms of how those behaviours are changing, and infer it from that instead.
That's great, thank you very much.